Thanks and welcome to all of you. Welcome to the panelists. We are all very excited to be here today and to be the only 100% female panel at this conference. We hope this is the first out of many. So we have a very interesting conversation for you all today. In the past 4 years, Europe has been facing what has been dubbed as the European migration crisis. We've all seen the images and seen the news reports. Migrant arrivals in Europe peaked in 2015 with 1.2 million people. Most of them were fleeing the Syrian and Libyan wars, but also other long-lasting conflicts in Afghanistan and Iraq. But out of those, 11% also came from Africa, places like Eritrea, Nigeria, Somalia. Most of these people were what we call refugees, so fleeing war and persecution at home. The number of arrivals has fallen since, but yet in the media we still hear regularly about this crisis, and it is shaping the news reports about Africa. In response, besides tougher border controls, Europe has also channeled billions of euros into various initiatives, both in terms of security and development, that are designed to keep people in their countries of origin. On this panel, we're going to attempt to look at the phenomenon of migration from a different angle. What is true also is that Europe is facing demographic pressure. The working age population is decreasing. By 2050, more than 34% of Europe's population is expected to be 60 or older. Some countries, like Portugal, a host country, are at near full employment. That means that they will need to export labor. Others, like France, are looking to Africa as their next and actually probably only real growth market. So in this context, migration can also be seen as an opportunity for growth and employment in Europe rather than a crisis. In the end, it's all a matter of perception. What is the story we hear about migration in Europe, and what is the story about Africa that we want to promote? So today on this panel, we have three African women who are living either in the diaspora or around the globe, traveling around the globe, all creative and activists who are strong promoters of a new global African narrative. And I'm really looking forward to hearing their thoughts. So Enuma, as you were introduced before, you're a Nigerian-American writer, lecturer, and creative consultant, and your work explores identity and culture, Africa and the diaspora, and the transforming power of story and narrative. Tina, you're also known as Tina Charisma. You're a model, a speaker, writer, and activist based in London, and you work professionally as an international development consultant, and you also have a lot of experience working in the charity, media, and government sector. And Vivian, you're the founder and director of the Leading Light Initiative and a youth advisor to UNESCO. As a social entrepreneur and seasoned humanitarian, you've been recognized as one emerging woman leader with the courage to lead change on the African continent. So I think you're all very well placed to discuss the topic that we have today. So to start off, Vivian, I want to ask you. So I've talked a bit about the responses that Europe has had to this migration crisis, both in terms of security and development. They're designed to keep young Africans in their countries of origin. But is it right to see migration as a failure of development? In today's globalized world, is it reasonable to expect young people to stay in their country?
Thank you so much, Marie. Ladies and gentlemen, good afternoon. Good afternoon. We just came back from lunch. First of all, it's an honor to be here. This is my first time in Portugal, so thank you so much to the organizers for the invitation. And back to your question, Marie, migration is as a result of a development failure. My answer is no, and a very big no, because based on the narrative you've just given us right now, migration is an opportunity for both economic stability and social stability in different countries, and it also brings that diversity that promotes opportunities and a platform for new ideas. And the world today has become such a global village that we cannot block people out. And young people today are very explorative and very curious and are constantly on the go to learn, to share, to engage, and to innovate. And I mean, now more than ever before, you cannot just You cannot block or cage young people to particular countries that they were born in or they grew in. For example, I'm a good example. I was born in Kenya. I've lived in the United States. I've lived in Senegal. I've lived in South Africa. And it's not because of a development failure, but it's because of a choice. I wanted to have an experience. I wanted to travel and see the world and also learn from different parts of the world. So back to you once again, it's a big no. And it's high time that we embrace migration and use it as an opportunity to develop, to learn, and to create and establish new industries, as the keynote speaker spoke about. Thank you.
Great, thank you. So actually, Tina, what's your point of view of this? Because you were born in Ghana and you live in the UK, so as both an African and a British person, migration was one of the hot topics of the whole Brexit debate. How has this impacted you personally in the way people relate to you, in the way you relate to your work, and has it made your work with community more difficult and more urgent?
Well, first of all, thank you for having me. The Euro-Africa Forum is doing great. I was coming here today and I was just thinking how historical this event is, just because young girls like me don't usually get these platforms, and to give me the opportunity to sit here today and talk is actually history being made right here. So thank you, guys. In response to your question, I actually grew up in the UK very young. I literally went to primary school in the UK. You can call it formal socialization through school. All happened in the UK. I went through a path of humanities, having a passion as a young activist who was involved in youth parliaments and other initiatives of young people who were super passionate and wanted to make a change. But through that process, I actually discovered that the education systems and the systems in general within the UK operated in a way where there was just one picture, one narrative, as you would like to call it. And my education process was a process of re-educating myself at a point. The first time I realized that I had to go through this process was through an opportunity I had to study in Sweden at a time in my education at Uppsala University. And I remember engaging with a lot of the literature there, and of course, the syllabus was so different in comparison to what you would teach at a UK school. You had history, but different modules in Uppsala that you didn't have in the UK. You had studies like African studies that weren't available at my home university. So I was like, wow, this is so interesting. I would sit in the class and being the only black person at Uppsala University, and everyone would be like, yeah, is right, yeah. And I'd be like, I have no idea, because, I'd been educated in the British system where a lot of the histories that I learned were actually Eurosceptic. And from a European perspective, we learned about Germany, we learned about European history and not African history. So I didn't know much about African history. But to say what I'm saying in response to your question is that process of re-educating myself. Being able to get in ground and being able to talk to people, being able to take the initiative to go and live in Ghana for a period, for 1 year, go to a boarding school there, not as a child growing up there, but as a fully formed young adult who already had her ideas, who already had her experiences. And that was tough. That was definitely a hard period. But back to Brexit, I believe Brexit reveals something that has always been there. I've been a firm believer of history, and when you look at history, migration has gone on for civilization. You always have groups who are in a place where they're hunting, gathering, and they decide to move somewhere for better facilities, for better resources, and they will move. It's part of natural resources. So I think we have evolved to a process or time and period where we are now building walls. It's all about these walls. It's all about how much can we get. And like our dear sister started in the beginning, humanity, we've lost that because it's gone beyond seeing a community, seeing a system where we can learn about one another to a point of me, myself, my country, making us great. Forget about the rest, but it's all about us. So I think in terms of Brexit and my work in the communities where we engage with a vast a diversity of people. Our work is very core around the ideas of diversity, I must mention, just because coming from the UK, we have different societies living in different places. You can go to an area where it's super wealthy and just across the road is like really not as affluent area. And it's about bringing community together to share ideas. And that is the power, that is the key that I've found. Just because when you bring these communities together, you learn that, wow, we're not so different. Our struggles are definitely shared. And you may be going through issues as a woman, but trust me, so am I. And we're able to be so authentic and come together and share with one another. And just, I love the good word of love on one another, which is just that process of just being supportive arms to one another. And I believe our politics do not actually exemplify that. Our politics actually exemplifies the opposite. And that is what I think is going on in the UK today and many places across Europe and around the world.
Great, and that echoes what Sianda told us about Ubuntu. Great. Enuma, in the midst of all of this and all this negative narrative about migration, there's actually been another one that has also emerged about at the same time, and that's very contradictory. It's the one of Africa rising. So several countries in the continent have actually experienced tremendous growth in recent years. And a number of skilled people from the diaspora have come back, a lot of them to start businesses on the continent. You've been what we call a repat yourself. How do you explain that these two narratives are existing side by side? The one about young people in Africa escaping poverty to go to Europe, and the one about skilled people from Africa going back to support the growth of the continent.
First of all, thank you for having me. It's really a pleasure to be here. Like Tina said, I'm usually the sole creative at these forums, so it's exciting to have one or two others. But thank you, the African Forum, for having me. I'm Igbo, I'm Nigerian. I was born in New York, but I was raised in Nigeria, Cote d'Ivoire, England, and the US. And I only lived in Nigeria for about 2 years as a child and decided as an adult to move back 4 years ago. And my ethnic tribe is Igbo. And in the Igbo culture, we're a culture of proverbs. I love proverbs. And one of my favorite proverbs is, when you wake up, that is your morning. In essence, it's never too late to sort of awaken to yourself and awaken to your purpose. And I liken that to the sense of, when I think about, Africans moving back or moving around, I think there's a sense in which young Africans are waking up. And waking up in the sense of recognizing that as Africans, we have another story than the story we've often taken on or accepted without question. And so much of what happens with narrative, which is sort of the thing I talk about and think about, I'm really interested in the stories we take on without challenging and the stories we put on to other people. And I happen to think that the world is made up of stories. Everything you hear is someone's version of a story versus another one's version, which is why someone might prefer to read the Washington Post versus the New York Times, because it's a different twist on the same story. So I think a lot about how stories shape us, how stories shape our way of thinking, how stories tell us things about who we are, but also give us perceptions about how we should see other people. So this story of Africa Rising, because I think that's just another story, I'm actually one of those who thinks it's an old story. I think when I hear Africa Rising, I always hear, to me, it connotes a sense of Africa still being a child and growing up. And I know that in relation to Africa Rising, that actually came out of sort of the commodities boom, which isn't recent at all. So I like to think about Africa as Africa expanding and sort of widening its breadth, Africans widening their breadth, both on the continent and globally. And I love the first panel we listened to today. Linda said something about it's time for Africans to recognize that they're global citizens. And I think to be a global citizen, you don't actually have to leave your country. You can be a global citizen and have a global mindset while staying put. But you can also be a global citizen by moving around. So how to hold these two together? I'd actually rather just sort of focus on redefining what it means to be African and sort of in the world, and what it means to sort of expand our culture and our notion of self. And once you do that, once you take ownership of your own story, you teach other people how to read you. You teach other people how to perceive you. So, I mean, I could talk about this forever. So I'll give you a chance to ask more questions.
No, but it's, I mean, that's what you say is very true. It's basically, Africa is such a massive and diverse continent. It's enormous. It's much larger than Europe. So it's only natural that there would be many competing
Narratives,
stories
yeah.
about such a diverse continent. And that's what Chimamanda Adichie referred to in her famous talk about the danger of a single story. We shouldn't stick to just one. And also what Chinua Achebe, another major Nigerian writer, called the balance of stories, right? With the more stories we have, the more we get into something that's maybe close to the truth. So how can we use African creativity and innovation to try and counter the influx of the negative stories with other kind of stories? And how do you guys do this in your work? Don't know who wants to answer this first. Tina, you feel.
Yeah, I mean, I think for me, in terms of my work, it's more about social action. So it has to do with a lot of engagement with diverse creatives. So on our platform, we will get together spoken word artists, we'll get together designers, we'll get together just plethora of different people working in different industries. And it's about really bringing people together to share on their ideas and how they can, speak and bring voice to some of these issues. So I think in general, in terms of that creativity, it's just being able to provide that platform. I think that's one of the most important things, just because a lot of the time we look at those who are maybe in academia just because they have all the theoretical answers and they have all the philosophical views. However, there's people on ground who are actually working directly and engaged, are on ground and authentically engaging with these issues. And I think it's very important to be able to say your voice matters and we believe in what you're doing and here's a platform and do more of it. Let's empower you to do that.
Anyway, tell us a little bit about what you see the role of art and culture being in there. For example, I was talking to African friends in the US just a few weeks ago, and they told me that there's a before and after Black Panther in terms of the way people relate to them. Because now they get, instead of getting very vague questions about Africa as a whole, now they're getting questions about where they're from specifically, their country, their cultures, their traditions. And that has become cool to be from Africa because of the power of that movie. Tell us a bit about why is this so powerful and which are some other examples of the power of that.
Yeah, and I think actually this will tie into a bit of what Tina was saying. I want to answer that question as well. I think part of the solution or the goal is to also remind people just how powerful the arts are, how powerful creativity is, that this is not a new thing, for the arts to be a channel in which we change perceptions, and to be a means of sort of casting both national identity and cultural identity. This has been going on for centuries, right? In the 14th, 15th, 16th century. It was through the arts. The people got a sense of who we are as a people. People got a sense of the ruling class. People got a sense of how they should see themselves and how they should be placed in relation to different social classes. So the arts, whether it's through literature, through the visual arts, through film, through music, now have always been a powerful means of teaching people how to think about the world and how to think about their place in the world. But so often we relegate the arts to, it's that thing that hippies and and people get to do when they have the time. Oh, it's amazing you're a writer. I wish I had time to write a book. Like that's a common thing. Or so the arts is a very powerful tool. Black Panther. To me, that movie was so interesting. It's a fun movie, but the thing about that movie is it casts the potential of Africa as this sort of fantasy science fiction narrative. Right, which I actually wrote an article about this once I saw Black Panther, and did the research to help people think there are places, everything you see happening in Black Panther, sort of the ideology behind it, is happening in Africa. Maybe not all in one place, but in pockets around Africa. So one of the means of getting people to think differently about narrative and story and perception, which is what all of this is about in some way, for me, through my medium as a writer, is I always try to get people to think about something, if I'm contrasting, putting two things together that you normally wouldn't think of, so I'm getting you to think about an idea that you already assume you know what it is, or you already assume you have a read on that. But then when you put these things together, it's like, oh, I never thought about it from that perspective. And to me, that's where the power lies. So it goes back to the keynote of what it means to change and shift imagination. And you cannot expect, whether it's an individual to a government, you cannot expect someone else to tell your story better than you can tell your story, because they will always tell the story in the way that benefits them. That is human nature. And so the first thing is learning, I think, to be aware that you have a story, so waking up to that. And when I say that, I speak as an individual, but also as a people. So to be aware that you have a story, to recognize that you have the power to shift that narrative, and that it's up to you. You know how they say in relationships, you teach people how to treat you? It's the same thing with your story. Right? You treat people how to see you and look at you and engage with you.
Great. And I want to get to Vivian here. So as we've discussed, so basically what storytelling does is that really taps into our humanity, and it shows us the humanity in others. We may look different, but our emotions, our fears, our hopes are the same as human beings. Vivian, you advise very powerful people, governments, international organizations, especially on women and youth in Africa. So how do you use, and you give talks all over the world, how do you use the power of storytelling to pursue these ideas in front of these people who have the power to decide and make laws and change the way the world's going?
That's a very good question, and I'm just going to go back to the question that you asked the other panelists on changing the narrative. I think let's not forget the power of education and how our curriculum have been organized, right? What image do we show the kids in Europe about Africa? Is it a begging continent? Is it a continent full of Ebola? Or is it a continent that everybody is dying from famine? Or is it a continent that's full of entrepreneurs, innovators, great artists, top doctors, and top lawyers? So I think the role of education is very important, and you have to make sure that it's an education that teaches about global citizenship. As I said initially, the world has become such a diverse global village that whatever happens in Europe affects Africa, and whatever happens in Africa affects Europe. But it will take us the conversation on equal partnership. How do we relay that? How do we communicate that? And the future of Europe is in the hands of young people, and the future of Africa is in the hands of young people. So how do we make sure that we invest in our young people today? What kind of skills, what kind of knowledge and information, what kind of exposure and storytelling are we exposing our young people so that when they grow up, when we grow up, then we become those leaders who, when you come to the drawing table, Europe and Africa, it's on equal partnership, and it's on respecting each and every voice at the table, respecting each and every idea on the table. I think that's what's going to take Europe and Africa to the next level, and that's what's going to create the trust. In all these conversations, we should talk about the future of trust. Where does it fall? Because some of the issues we're grappling with today are closing of borders, wanting to protect your borders and your countries alone and only your people. It's because of the future of trust. That's another conversation that we need to have. When it comes to Europe and Africa relationship, where does that fall? How can we tackle that?
That's exactly my next point, and I'm glad that you bring it up. Because right now we've been talking about basically changing Europe's narrative of Africa. But there's two partners here. There's also a narrative that Africa has of Europe. And is there trust there? What is your guys' response when you hear that Europe wants to change the relationship it has with Africa? Do you trust the intentions of Europe, first of all? And what can Europe do to foster that trust?
Can I just jump on that? When it comes to, first of all, it's exciting, right? When you hear that Europe wants to not really engage, but rethink their engagement with Africa, because the engagement has always been there since what is it called? The partition of Africa. The engagement has always been there. But I think right now it comes to the future of trust. But the future of trust is going to come as a result of how does Europe see Africa at the decision-making table, at the negotiation table? Are we rescuing them, or are we seeing them as equal partners and equal players in this development and the heated political and social arena that we all are in right now. So I think it's the mentality that we come to the table with. It's not about trying to rescue, it's not trying to help, but looking at each other as equal partners with both stronger powers and both stronger capabilities to be able to come together and decide on the way forward. And I think once we start looking at each other as equal partners, that's what's going to take us forward. But right now, I don't think there's trust.
Right. Enuma, the reason why there's no trust, right, is because very often European countries come and they talk down to Africa from a position of superiority. We see this on the ground a lot. Actually, there was an interview with Kagame, which you mentioned to me earlier, where he lashed out about that on television. At the same time, we have to recognize there is a lack of leadership in many African countries. And you have mentioned to me the example of the Mo Ibrahim Prize that is supposed to go, it's $5 million, I think, that is supposed to go to an African head of state who leaves power when he or she is supposed to, so doesn't try to stick in power, and has had a good leadership. And several years in a row, they haven't found a winner. Nobody worthy of that prize. So how do we can ask Europe to talk to Africa as equal partners when there are these issues, and what is the right balance? Should Europe stay away from that conversation or still engage in how?
I think what you're asking me, I'll answer what I think you're asking me. I don't think we can stay away from the conversation for starters, right? Because it's through dialogue we sort of work things out and figure out the best way forward. As far as should Europe engage with Africa or not in these ways, I still want to go back, though, to some of the last question when Vivian was answering about, you posed a question of how does Africa perceive Europe? And this also falls into answering the question you asked me. I think we have to look at, everything that's on the table. I'd love to sit up here as an African and say, oh, Africa is perfect. We don't have anything to learn or grow, but that's just not the fact. That's not true. We still have areas in which we can grow, just as Europe has the same areas. So one of that is learning ways to be more effective leaders. And I actually happen to think that, the fact that we keep throwing out these figures of how within so many years Africa's population will be this many number and it will continue to be people under 25 or so. And you can look at that as sort of a demographic curse, or you can look at it as opportunity, right? And I look at it as opportunity because these are the future leaders. These are the people who will be leading the continent. So that's kind of where my focus is when I'm thinking about leadership. It's on young people, not on this sort of recycling rotation of people in their 70s and 80s, which is most of the leaders on the continent. It's true. But so focusing on the young folks. But I also think to some regard, I started off by talking about sort of when you wake up, it's your morning, waking up to yourself and waking up. Part of that is waking up to understanding your capabilities and your own power. And I think to some regard, as a whole, more of us Africans can wake up to really believing and trusting that we have the skills and we have, not that we don't need Europe's help, of course we do, because partnership is the answer to any successful venture, from your personal life to business to the world. But I think we've been trained, and this has been training through centuries, as Africans, to sort of believe or think that anything we need has to come from outside. So really, we have to learn to trust ourselves, before even thinking about, how to build trust with it. It's trust that we are capable and we have the intelligence and the skill power, and how do you learn to look at what's in the family before stepping out and saying, they've got
just jumping because this is one of the questions we receive from the audience.
Okay.
Just responding to it perfectly. What can we do together for African families to believe on their own capabilities and in their own countries?
What can we do?
Together for Africans to believe in their own capabilities in their own countries, which is what you
And I would love to hear what you have to say about this too, Tina, as a younger person. But first of all, I think we can pay attention to what's happening on the continent, and we can start to listen to young people. In Nigeria, we can start to listen to young people and listen to their wants, and also we can find ways to support capacity building and training, but one of the biggest pieces to doing that is feeding money into infrastructure. Because it's wonderful to think about how can we sit around the table and talk about changing the narrative and building this, but honestly, if you don't have a on-the-ground infrastructure system that allows you to actually do the work you need to do or allows you to move forward, it's really hard. One of the reasons I've been in Nigeria about 4 years, and I'm now in between Nigeria and the US, and one of those key reasons is I get so much more work done when I'm out of the country for
where you have power.
very simple reasons like power. And I know Linda talked about this in the first session. But here's the thing, those are all solvable issues. Those aren't necessarily issues that should keep us from growing. So I look at them as ways in which to grow. I don't necessarily look at them as ways in which we say, oh, Africa doesn't have what it takes.
Right. Tina, you do so much work on the ground. How can Europe and Africa start to engage on an equal footing? Do you have examples of practical things from your work from communities that maybe can be used by anybody on how to create this collaboration?
Yeah, with this partnership, I think is a partnership that has a lot to do with a reconditioning of Europeans, but also reconditioning of Africans themselves. Mm-hmm. And it works on both the continent of Africa, but also Europe. Like you rightly said, I think historically, there's been an ingrained mental idea that somehow Africans can't think for themselves, or we have European systems that have been intentionally been put in place to create this unconscious kind of ideas that cause Africans to really be dependent on Europeans in general. I believe if we really want to create a partnership that moves a lot of African countries forward, it's going to come down with us individually as well. Examples of this, I work and manage quite a number of teams. I have individuals who have from zero skills of volunteering up to people who are qualified professionals. I've had instances, for example, where I've had volunteers come in, and after a few months, I've had a CEO who came up to me and said, well, Tina, she's working so much better. Like, what's going on? Like, what's happened? And I smiled because I knew exactly what's happened, just because I was intentional about the process. But what I did with this girl, with her one-to-one, was tell her to just be free. I said, simply, just do you. Go shine, girl. I'm like, girl, just do you. And throughout the months, I saw this girl unravel in a way that I'd never seen before. And I told the CEO, you know something? When you just trust in people, watch them be ready to fly. Just because when you trust people and give them a role and say, look, I believe in you, and you're not waiting for them to fall, most likely they will rise and do a great job. But when you are actually on people and trying to micromanage them, waiting for them to trip, you're likely to create someone who's uneasy, who's unable to be authentic and comfortable, to be able to be creative and bring in these skills. And that is what we need on the bigger picture as well, because we have young professionals who are very capable all across the African continent. It's down to individuals, head of businesses, entrepreneurs, leaders in political governments to say, well, you know what? This is a space. Come, do your thing. Let's watch you shine. And these spaces, believe it or not, I think is the future. Just because I told someone earlier today, I'm saying, ask the young people, we're up and we're ready and we're not standing down. And that's the powerful thing about the next generation of African diasporas. They're ready. Through culture, through fashion. I decided to wear this intentionally today because this is beautiful. And I thought, you know what? I'm going to come on the stage and wear something I love. And isn't it beautiful? But yes, this is something we need to celebrate. I think it's definitely something we just need to say, look, it's beautiful. Let's celebrate this. Let's give the spaces to this. And before you know it, it creates a partnership that is not dogmatic, but is authentic and allows people to thrive.
Mm-hmm. So,
Just to,
You want to respond to
just
this?
one
Go
more
ahead.
thing. I think again on certain partnerships that I think are working, and something that I think exchange programs are very important. Also for young people, there you get to learn about different cultures, different countries, how people operate, how people work, and I think that as a young person, it empowers you and gives you certain confidence when it comes to such kind of interactions and knowing your place in a global context. And I think one of the programs that I would like to talk to is the French Africa Young Leaders Program between the French government and the African government. And now they're bringing young people together for a fellowship. It's a one-year fellowship. Part of the fellowship is in Paris, and part of the fellowship is in Accra, Ghana. And it's also, they have half of the fellows are from Africa, half of the fellows are from France. So it gives them the opportunity to interact with government leaders, business leaders, social entrepreneurs, and people in the creative space. So the French young leaders are learning from Africa. The Africans, when they go to France, they also have the opportunity to learn how their governments run, how they run their business. And I think that gives us that kind of awareness and also that kind of knowledge that's very important for platforms such as the Euro Africa. And I hope we can also see more of Portugal and Africa. I know the work that Portugal is doing in Mozambique and all those other countries, but also when it comes to young people, how can you make sure that we put them at the forefront and continue investing in them? Because I think those are some of the meaningful partnerships that's going to push this agenda forward.
Absolutely.
So we don't have a lot of time left. I would still want to touch on that final issue. Sianda talked about the concept of Ubuntu, and basically we are because others are. We are human because we recognize the humanity in others. That's a very famous and strong African concept. What are other examples of what Europe could learn from Africa and that would help create a more balanced relationship between the two continents? Who wants to take that one?
I'm trying to keep it on a sort of creative level, but I'll broaden it because we're closing. I think a couple of things in relation to the broader context of this forum, that there are ways in which, we started off talking about, where the title of this panel is about valuing migrant talent, and thinking about human flow and migration and actually seeing it as a positive and actually not a crisis. And I actually wish we had more time to talk about that, changing that perception and naming some facts that aren't actually named about the number of Africans who are migrating out of Africa and those who are migrating intercontinentally. And it's more Africans that are migrating within the continent than outside. You actually have more Europeans migrating than Africans migrating as far as like global figures. So more than 70% of African migrants are intercontinental. And one of the beautiful things that we see happening on the continent but isn't widely sort of storied or publicized is how different African nations are opening borders for. I mean, we have a long way to go as far as African countries sort of unifying. But one way with this flow of this human flow for various reasons, some war-torn, but mostly economic reasons. You have different countries who are opening borders to migrants and instilling policies that enable migrants to make a living, to have access to education, to get driver's license, all these very basic things that help people not only feel valued, but help them prosper, right? So you have a country like Ethiopia, and our narrative of Ethiopia, which is decades old, is poor Ethiopia, right? But yet you have a country like Ethiopia which enables migrants to get driver's license, register like life and death, get certificates, access education. So that example, then you have, Rwanda could be a case study on its own, and how Rwanda is also, they have that free movement of people, which opens up the trade market or the market. You have Uganda, Uganda when it comes to like assisting others and migration is one of the top 3 in the world, right? Their policies, and the other 2 aren't even European, right? They're Turkey and Pakistan. So I think one way that Europe can learn from Africa, you always learn, the best way I found in learning anyways, to start by listening. So you start by listening and observing what's happening and taking note of that, and adjusting the way you engage with the other partner based on what you see happening. And I want to give others a chance to close.
Thank you for that. I think that was a great example and the way to wrap things up. We have a few seconds left. I want to give each of you time to maybe give us your conclusion, your final statement. What should people take away from today, Vivian?
First and foremost, I think I'm going to keep it short. Young Africans don't need to be rescued. They only need opportunities. And I think that's the basic platform for engagement. And I think also it's very important for the Euro-Africa Partnership of Equals to be a reality so that we don't fail my generation that believes on global citizenship and a borderless world.
Very good. Enuma?
I think it's really important to tell all sides of the story. You know, as a storyteller, we always tend to be biased, but to listen to all sides of the story and to remember and see and use how powerful the arts are in changing narratives. And I think we should have more cultural exchange programs between different countries. So we always think on this grand continental scale, but what does it look like on the ground? Most change happens from the ground up. So how do we begin to partnership with Ministry of Culture and Tourism, or have residencies where you have people from different countries coming together, playwrights from different countries coming together and studying, or writers or artists. I mean, there's so many ways if we even get creative with our thinking. So I think I'll close there.
And Tina, what can people take away from this session?
Practice humanity.
Lovely.
Simply, we read a whole lot. We have an academic system that teaches us and pumps a whole lot into us, but humanity is actually from the inside. It's very interesting how a lot of events like this, you have professionals who are somehow serious, you know, because that's the education, that's the status, that's the class. But humanity is actually very simple, and it's one of those things that you can't buy with class, education, race, just simply from the inside. And it may not even be a topic for a platform like this, but after writing a whole lot of articles and pitching and writing about Africa and saying, Africa is not a continent, Africa is this, Africa is that. Well, lots of people have been doing that for a while now and still look at us. The simple thing is for us to all go back to our offices, our workplace, and start to really evaluate what is going on. When you look around, who's around you? What is the diversity like? You want to influence and create partnerships in Africa, but no one looks like anyone. Like, get uncomfortable. I always say this at every event, by the way. I'm professionally renowned for making people feel uncomfortable, just because some of the conversations we talk about are that uncomfortable and are very serious. So I hope that you're all challenged to go back and get a bit uncomfortable and shape and whip things up to really start to be active about these conversations. Otherwise, there's no point of having this conversation at all.
Great way to
Wonderful. Thank you. Thank you to all our panelists. Thank you
Wonderful.
for this wonderful debate.
Great.